Mail, Dominic Sambrook opines that the plunging pound is nothing to celebrate. It means we'll pay more for sun hats and lollies on holiday, fruit and veg in the supermarket, and appliances on the high street. Politics in the United States as well. The Democrats have begun the process of choosing a candidate for the next presidential election. David Simmons suggesting, however, that the big winner so far is Donald Trump. Well, with me today to look through all of those, the political journalist and consultant Emma Burnell and the political strategist Ed Rennie. Morning, guys. Good to see you again. And let's skip a few of our stories and start actually with the Trevor Kavanagh column in The Sun, page 10 for them. The backstop is a voodoo spell to bewitch and befuddle the feeble-minded. He's not holding back, Trevor, is he?
Well, it's not really his style to hold back. I mean, however wrong I may think he is, he certainly makes his opinion clear.
So what is his point here? Why are we being so befuddled? You know, because frankly, even the last Prime Minister thought it was quite a good idea.
Well, I mean, it's an integral part of the Good Friday Agreement. In order to unpick the Good Friday Agreement and maintain peace between on the island of Ireland, there are incredible complications that have been just dismissed by our membership of the European Union, because that just meant that everything on that border, we went from having armed guards on a border to people just crossing, you know, at will. And people don't want to go back to not being able to cross at will, but if we don't have trade alignment, then things will have to be checked at borders. That's just how that works.
I mean, wasn't this all just patently obvious from day one, that the European Union, you know, if we're leaving the single market, if we're leaving the customs union, the European Union did not want an open border?
Well, I think from quite early on, they collaborated with the Irish government, quite understandably for political reasons, to get something that penned in the British government and meant that leaving the EU would actually be rather difficult. It's in the EU's political interest to make leaving the EU look as difficult as possible, because frankly, actually, they are concerned that other countries will want to leave too. If you can leave...
Certainly there hasn't been the groundswell of support for leaving the European Union that was predicted perhaps in certain countries.
No, they're looking at us and going, my God, no, don't do that. I mean, you complain about it, change it, absolutely, but I mean, it is incredibly difficult. I would like to pick Ed up on just one thing that he said there. The Irish didn't collaborate with the EU. They are part of the EU. They are working together in the partnership that they've elected to be in.
I think that's politically naive. If you look at the negotiations that the Greeks went through, there are representatives of politicians in each country of the EU who are very pro-EU, and there are politicians who are much more European sceptic. In terms of, I mean, I agree that other countries leaving the EU is not popular, but that's precisely the EU's intention, is to make it look as difficult and complex as possible.
Or now, difficult and complex as it is.
Well, the reality is that there is complexity and there is difficulty, but these are technical issues. The point is that the politics that overrides that, and my disagreement on the Irish border is more about that I agree that the politics is the problem, and you don't have goodwill on both sides. If you have goodwill on both sides, a bilateral agreement between the Irish and the British government, supported by the EU, is actually fairly pragmatically easy to achieve. It's just the political will isn't there.
Well, let's look at the O'Hanlon piece in the Telegraph, page 17 there. The idea that even if leaving the European Union does have significant negative impact on the United Kingdom, you know, unity on the Isle of Ireland is by no means an inevitability.
I think it's closer than Scotland leaving the UK. I think people talk up that, or if we have a no-deal Brexit or a WTO Brexit, then Scotland will want to leave the UK as quickly as possible, forgetting that, of course, you would have all the problems that came out of the referendum in Scotland previously about how you would re-enter the EU. Obviously, there's a slightly different dynamic because you would have been leaving the UK, which was then in the EU. With Northern Ireland, I think you can see that the reasons, the tectonic plates may be shifting. It's much clearer that that's happening, or rather that it's happening more quickly. So I could see, despite all the intense difficulties that would involve, I can actually see the push for that accelerating faster than in Scotland, where you're saying, what, you're really going to rejoin the common fisheries policy, sign up to, in principle, joining the euro? You know, the political reasons for that not happening are much clearer.
I mean, is this really where we're at? Yeah. Even if leaving the EU is a disaster, we may not lose the union. That's now where we've got to in terms of our hopes for the future. That's quite an extraordinary place. That's our optimistic vision now.
Yeah, at the same time, though, I mean, I was listening to Mary Lou McDonald immediately after her meeting with the Prime Minister at Stormont yesterday, and practically the first words out of her mouth were border poll. You know, if she was already talking about some form of vote if there is a negative impact on Northern Ireland, a significant negative impact, that would represent the material change in circumstances that she thinks would precipitate a poll. And if we're talking about polls, well, we're not too far away from them.
No.
Well, but Irish politics as a whole is shifting very, very quickly. So, for example, up until as late as 2016, Sinn Féin's policy was anti the EU. It was a pro United Ireland leaving the EU for the same reason that a proportion of Welsh nationalists and Scottish nationalists are anti the EU. But culturally as well, I mean, Sinn Féin used to be a kind of nominally anti-abortion party. You've seen the massive shifts in the north and the south on those social issues. So Irish politics, I think, is changing much more rapidly. That's underlying more the reason why Irish unity might come faster than for independence for Scotland. And obviously, I don't agree that a WTO Brexit would be a disaster, just for the record.
I mean, we touched on it last hour, but is it possible that some of the vitriol that is contained in the papers that's currently being directed at Leo Varadkar, directed at Ireland, it's a kind of a cultural hangover. You know, we don't like the Irish telling us what to do here in London, do we?
Well, I think there is, there's a huge cultural history. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Troubles. I've lived in London my whole life. I remember some of the bombings that happened in London. I remember, of course, the Omagh bombings and the Manchester bombings. This is what the history that everyone is forgetting, and the history that we worked so hard in the 90s and to put behind us. And I think it's extraordinary that we are not just in terms of what we're doing practically in terms of Brexit, but in terms of the rhetoric and the language that we're employing. Just forgetting how hard we worked to come back together and to make sure that we were living in peace.
And let's have a look at Dominic Sandbrook's piece in the Mail, page 18 there. And he's pointing to something we've been tracking this week, the plunging pound and what that necessarily means. Now, there are some people who've suggested, this is great for exports, great for manufacturing. Actually, it stuffs all of us because we're having to spend more money, aren't we?
Well, I think the reality is that the large falls in sterling came after the referendum, and some of that did impact in prices, although the inflation was going up across the continent of Europe at the same time. But actually, there's no reason, apart from your ice creams and your holidays, why it should necessarily affect your spending power. And certainly it would be good for manufacturing if it was sustained. I mean, here's the key thing. The really interesting thing is when we do leave the EU, are we going to make a political effort to maintain an internationally competitive exchange rate and therefore boost our manufacturing? Because you can say the deindustrialized areas of the country, the big 70%, 60% votes for leaving the EU were actually those deindustrialized heartlands of our country, which we maybe can't go back to the glory days of the past, but actually we could just do a little bit to rebalance the economy and make sure that we're not so focused on London, the South, and services. And that's a critical thing, which, yes, we could have focused on, provided we're outside the euro, obviously, inside the EU. But actually, will the referendum and leaving the EU be the thing that actually pushes us to do what we really need to do in terms of domestic policy?
I mean, just as we wrap up, I wonder if you can turn your political antenna across the Atlantic to the United States. Cartoon in the Times there. I have to say, which I find a certain degree of agreement with, the big winner at the moment as the Democratic candidates knock lumps out of each other in the second night of debate, the big winner is Donald Trump.
I'm not entirely sure that's true. Now, of course, I don't necessarily want that to be true. I'm happy to pin my colours to that mast. But I think the thing about Donald Trump, the one thing Donald Trump hates more than anything else is not being talked about. And actually, what we're talking about now is the Democrats. Now, the Democrats are indeed knocking lumps out of each other. That's the primary process. The question is whether they can unite behind the candidate that they eventually choose. Now, parties do traditionally do that. There was some problem with that in 2016. A lot of the people who really like Bernie Sanders couldn't get behind Hillary Clinton. So I think it depends who in the end gets the nomination. But if it's someone that they can unite behind and uniting behind not being Donald Trump is a pretty uniting factor, I think, for the Democrats.
Ed, good to see you today. Thank you for your chat, both this hour and last. We'll see you again soon.